Early Daoist texts and textual criticism. First, let's review last week's lecture. In that second lecture on Zhuangzi, I said that Zhuangzi understands nature as a process and as a system of beings which have no interest in human categories. Zhuangzi encourages humans to imitate natural processes and be willing to change along with nature rather than to follow human goals. In practical terms, according to the text, that means that action should be guided by intuition that comes from experience in any given situation, not by abstract principles and instructions which come from classic books. Finally, we learned that the Dao De Jing and the Zhuangzi have important points of both similarity and difference. In this week's lecture, I will explain what textual criticism is and how it can affect the interpretation of early Chinese texts. I'll discuss the alternate versions of the text of the Dao De Jing, which were unearthed at the Mawangdui and Guodian sites. I'll discuss evidence for the stratification of different materials in the Zhuangzi. And then finally, I'll ask you to consider how complex textuality and multiple authorship might affect the interpretation of these texts. In our lectures so far, we've been treating the Dao De Jing as if it were written by a single author named Lao Tzu, and we've been treating the Zhuangzi as if it were written by a single author named Zhuangzi or Zhuangzhou. Now, this is the way that most readers have understood these two books for most of Chinese history, and it is important for us to have understood what most readers thought these two authors were trying to say. However, throughout the lectures so far, I've also been hinting that these texts were really not written by single authors. Today, we'll consider what that means for how we should understand these two books. The term textual criticism refers to the discipline in which scholars examine ancient texts and try to determine how they evolved and how errors may have crept into texts as they were copied and recopied. Originally, both in China and the West, the purpose of textual criticism was primarily to correct texts that had errors in them, and to restore texts to the original words which had first been written by the author. However, in doing textual criticism of the Dao De Jing and the Zhuangzi, it's important to focus not on trying to restore a hypothetical work by Lao Tzu or Zhuangzhou, but instead to separate out different versions of the texts and different ideas which were promoted by different authors who contributed to the final versions which we have today. Now, scholars have known for centuries that the most commonly used versions of the Dao De Jing, such as the one used for the translation by D.C. Lau, which you've been reading, were edited into their final form during the 1st or 2nd century A.D. And most readers just assumed that these were more or less the same as whatever the person named Lao Tzu had written in the 6th century BC, even though that's 700 years, that's a pretty long time for any text to remain stable before the invention of printing. However, the notion that these texts were stable for that long a time started to change drastically with two important archaeological discoveries which have become central to studies of the Dao De Jing. First, let's talk about the Mawangdui texts. In 1963, tombs were discovered at Mawangdui in Changsha City in Hunan Province in the south of China, dating to the early 2nd century BC. These tombs were excavated during the early 1970s, and there were many ritual objects and religious medical texts, but among all these different objects, it was also discovered that there were two different copies of the Dao De Jing. These copies were written originally on silk, and they survived in fragments, such as the one which you see in the picture on the right, which is now stored and put on display in the Hunan Provincial Museum in Changsha. These texts were not the same as those in the standard versions of the Dao De Jing. Since they were earlier, this suggested to scholars that the standard Dao De Jing was actually a less accurate version. Next, let's talk about the Guodian text. In 1993, another version of the Dao De Jing was unearthed from a tomb near Jingmen in Hubei province. This version was slightly older than the Mawangdui version. Carbon dating set the date for it as the late 3rd century BC. This text was written on bamboo slips, not silk. And it was different from both the later standard version, but also different from the Mawangdui version. And this suggests that there may never have been only one original edition, or at least even if there was, it would probably be impossible to know what that edition was. Now, these excavated texts from Guodian and Mawangdui do not come to us in helpful, modern printed form. It isn't as if nice, modern-style printed books were placed in the tombs. Instead, both the bamboo strips from Guodian and the silk from Mawangdui are dirty, stained, faded, torn, and rotted after having sat in these tombs for 2,200 years. As a result, even with very careful archaeological work to clean off the texts and decipher them, the texts they produced were very hard to read. They were out of order. Many of the words were simply unrecoverable, leaving large blanks in the alternate texts. And for your in-class exercise this week, you'll be asked to do an exercise that simulates the difficulty of working with texts in this condition. For now, let's take a look at what some of these differences really look like. I'll start by reading a passage from the standard received version of the Dao De Jing, which you read in D.C. Lau's translation. Then we'll compare it with a version from one of the excavated texts. Here you can see that all the words that are changed between the two versions will be in red. You can feel free to fast forward and rewind to compare the two. So, here first is a quote from verse 17 and 18 of the standard text of the Dao De Jing. The best of all rulers is but a shadowy presence to his subjects. Next comes the ruler they love and praise. Next comes one they fear. Next comes one with whom they take liberties. When there is not enough faith, there is lack of good faith. Hesitant, he does not utter words lightly. When his task is accomplished and his work done, the people all say, "It happened to us naturally." When the great way falls into disuse, there are benevolence and rectitude. When cleverness emerges, there is great hypocrisy. When the 6 relations are at variance, there are filial children. When the state is benighted, there are loyal ministers. Now let's take a look at the same passage as it is written in Guodian version C. At first, this passage might sound extremely similar, and overall it is. But if you look carefully, you'll notice there are some important differences in the details. The great ruler is but a shadowy presence to his subjects. Next comes the ruler they love and praise. Next comes one they fear. Next comes one with whom they take liberties. When there is not enough faith, there is lack of good faith. His schemes are those which value words. When he has accomplished his work and finished his task, the people are the ones who say, "It happened to us naturally." Thus, when the great way falls into disuse, how can there be benevolence and rectitude? When the 6 relations are at variance, how can there be filial children? When the country is blank night, how can there be upright ministers? Many of the changes you see in red are small, not particularly important. However, there is one small change which is important. Remember that on the last slide, the passage ends by saying, "When the great way falls into disuse, there are benevolence and rectitude. When cleverness emerges, there is great hypocrisy. When the 6 relations are at variance, there are filial children. When the state is benighted, there are loyal ministers." The notion there was a traditional critique of Confucian values. In other words, it is only when the way grows into disuse and is forgotten that men like Confucius need to come along and invent ideas like benevolence and righteousness to get people back on the right track. In other words, that version offers a clear critique of Confucian values. However, in the earlier Guodian version, notice the end says, "When the great way falls into disuse, how can there be benevolence and rectitude? When the 6 relations are at variance, how can there be filial children? When the country is blank night, how can there be upright ministers?" In other words, this earlier version was actually praising and accepting those traditional Confucian virtues. It was saying something quite opposite, that when the great way falls into disuse, virtues are also forgotten. So, what conclusions can we draw from this comparison? Number 1, we can say that the Mawangdui and Guodian versions of the Tao Te Ching do not promote radically different ideas overall from those of the standard version. The passages we compared just now had a lot of things to say that were exactly the same, and the general idea was also the same, that one should respect the Tao. The great Tao is important and is key to the ruler's action. But there are often also significant details which are changed. And some of those details, even if there are small changes, can greatly affect how we interpret some individual sentences, such as, in this case, whether or not the passage was intended to harmonize with Confucianism or to attack Confucianism. Now, it is impossible to pin down one version on a specific author. Hence, these texts should not be treated as deriving from Lao Tzu's personal disagreement with Confucianism, because who knows who it was who actually wrote these different versions down in the first place. Instead, it's better to treat this book as a kind of popular book of wisdom, which evolved through many versions among the people of the kingdom of Chu, where both the Mawangdui and the Guodian versions were excavated from, the territory of that old kingdom. Now let's move on to think about Zhuangzi textual criticism. This is somewhat different from how we work with the Tao Te Ching because, unlike with the Tao Te Ching, there have not been significant archaeological discoveries of earlier texts of the Zhuangzi. However, from traditional sources, we actually already know a lot about the mixed evolution of this text. We know that the version we possess today dates to the 3rd century AD and was heavily edited and condensed by its last editor. Moreover, the standard version is itself broken down into inner chapters, which were originally presumed authentic to Zhuangzhou, outer chapters, which were originally presumed to be the work of his later disciples, and mixed chapters, which were originally uncertain in origin. So even ancient readers already could have known, and in some cases were vaguely aware, that this book as a whole was not necessarily written by Zhuangzhou personally. However, modern scholarship has gotten much more detailed in trying to disentangle various strands of the Zhuangzi. Partially this is done through linguistic evidence, since scholars who are specialists in historical linguistics can tell that some portions of the text were written centuries before other portions of the text. Partially, though, this can also be done by identifying different parts of the text which seem to be advocating different ideas from each other. The result is that scholars now generally agree that there is a wide mix of materials from different writers which has been combined in the Zhuangzi. This dates from the late Warring States period up through the end of the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century AD. Some of these materials may have been by writers who thought of themselves as Daoist, but other materials are definitely by writers who were advocating different ideas. Let's see how to do this kind of textual criticism with respect to the Zhuangzi by comparing two passages from sections of the book which you read for last week. First, let's start from a passage from Rifling Trunks. Cudgel and cane the sages, and let the thieves and bandits go their way. Then the world will at last be well ordered. If the stream dried up, the valley will be empty. If the hills wash away, the deep pools will be filled up. And if the sage is dead and gone, then no more great thieves will arise. The world will then be peaceful and free of fuss. But until the sage is dead, great thieves will never cease to appear. And if you pile on more sages in hopes of bringing the world to order, you will only be piling up more profit for Robber Zhi. He who steals a belt buckle pays with his life. He who steals a state gets to be a feudal lord, and we all know that benevolence and righteousness are to be found at the gates of the feudal lords. This passage seems to be like a standard Daoist critique of Confucianism. It's very suspicious of the traditionally Confucian virtues of benevolence and righteousness, and it's also very suspicious of the Confucian reverence for sages and wise kings, instead asserting that kings are just another kind of thief. Let's contrast this with a different passage from the Way of Heaven chapter. Emptiness, stillness, limpidity, silence, inaction are the root of the 10,000 things. To understand them and face south is to become a ruler such as Yao was. To understand them and face north is to become a minister such as Shun was. To hold them in high station is the virtue of emperors and kings of the Son of Heaven. To hold them in lowly station is the way of the dark sage, the uncrowned king. Retire with them to a life of idle wandering, and you will command first place among the recluses of the rivers and seas, the hills and forests. Come forward with them to succor the age, and your success will be great, your name renowned, and the world will be united. In stillness you will be a sage, in action a king. Now in this passage, we still, from the first, see an advocacy of virtues which are stereotypically Daoist: emptiness, stillness, limpidity, silence, and inaction. However, a focus on these Daoist virtues is then immediately said to be the basis for being a virtuous, wise ruler, or a pure sage. In other words, this passage does not see any direct conflict with the standard focus of Confucian reverence for the wise ruler or the sage. A complete contradiction to the attitude of the earlier passage, who said that such people were like robbers. So, what conclusions can we draw from this comparison? In the overall direction, if you don't look too closely, most of the different chapters of the Zhuangzi seem to be saying more or less the same thing. In the case of the example that we just looked at, both of those passages were ultimately promoting a kind of natural, quiet behavior and harmony with the way. However, there's obviously also direct contradiction on details. In this case, one passage says that adopting such naturalism is the best way to be a sage or a ruler, but the other says that it is completely incompatible with the notion of sages or rulers. This contradiction suggests that these two passages come from two different schools, one of which admired the teachings of Zhuangzi-style Taoism and tried to demonstrate that it was compatible with Confucianism. Another, which also admired Zhuangzi-style Taoism because it was perceived as directly opposed to Confucianism. Therefore, we should not look at any random passage from the book and assume that it must represent Taoism as Zhuangzhou personally meant it. We should also not assume that the Zhuangzi as a whole book is internally consistent. If two passages seem to contradict each other, that's probably because they were written by different people with different beliefs. So, in part, we therefore need to understand the meaning of the book not as the statement of a unified philosophy, but rather as a process of evolution by which several related philosophies were grouped together by editors who copied and recopied the text. However, for later traditional Chinese readers, remember that the whole book was usually understood to be written by Zhuangzhou or by his immediate followers, and hence represented a consistent viewpoint. Even though that is a misunderstanding of the text, those later readers' misunderstandings are very important to understanding the later history of Taoism in China and its influence on all of Chinese civilization. So, for the rest of the class, we are going to continue to talk about the Zhuangzi as if it were a unified text insofar as we are thinking about its influence on later writers and artists. There's one more thing that we can deduce from these textual studies of the origins of both the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, and that is that it seems to have been, in part, a kind of regional belief system. The fact that the only two archaeological discoveries of the Tao Te Ching were in regions belonging to the ancient kingdom of Chu in southern China naturally suggests that the book was most important and most influential there. Now, according to his own traditional biography from ancient sources, we also learn that Zhuangzhou was himself a native of that same kingdom of Chu. We know that the Zhuangzi was edited at an early stage by a member of the Han Dynasty royal family who was trying to preserve ancient Chu culture. Moreover, the book also has linguistic relationships to other Chu-based texts, such as the lyrics of Chu or Chuzi. So therefore, what we now call Taoism may have originally been thought of as a kind of regional culture or regional belief system native to this one kingdom in southern China. And although the Han Dynasty was officially Confucian, it seems to have played an important role in transforming Taoism from a regional tradition into a national one. Let's summarize today's lecture. First, remember, neither the Dao De Jing nor the Zhuangzi are actually unified texts written by a single author. Second, textual criticism of the versions of the Dao De Jing, which come from Ma Wangdui and Guo Dian, allow us to see how that text evolved over the period of the Warring States and Han Dynasty, and suggests that there may have never been just one stable version of the book. And finally, careful examination of the different parts of the standard version of the Zhuangzi allows us to see that it is composed of different strata, written at different periods and by different schools, which were influenced by Zhuangzhou in varying ways. For next week, remember, study for your midterm exam.